when it comes to open source projects, and WhiteBox is no exception, there are out there every day many thousands of people who use the software that we create as open source developers in their day-to-day lives, for research, for education, for earning money in terms of a company, revenue in a company. And so if there are companies out there that can use WhiteBox tools in order to generate their revenue, then it somewhat only makes sense, I suppose, that the developer of that tool should also be able to use it, leverage it to be able to generate revenue.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the Geospatial community. That voice you just heard, that was John Lindsay, and you might recognize him from last week's episode. Last week, John was on the show talking about WhiteBox Tools. So that was a technical episode talking about a tool set, an open source geospatial tool set that he created and maintains. This week, we're not talking about the tool set itself. We're talking about how John and his co-founder Anthony are building a business around this open source project. We're going to talk about why they made that decision, why a business is the right solution for them, what they intend to do with the revenue, and how they intend to generate it. And my hope for this episode is to provide a template for other people that are in a similar position, other developers out there, other people involved in open source projects that are struggling to make ends meet, that are struggling to find the resources that they need to continue the work that they are doing. Now, I'm not suggesting a business is the right model for every open source project, but I do think that a lot of people involved in open source software and the geospatial world might resonate with John's story. But before we get there, I want to thank my sponsor, WhiteBox. So you can find WhiteBox at lightboxre.com. And what do they do? Well, WhiteBox is a data platform, and it's an authoritative source of North American real estate and location intelligence data. So you're probably wondering, what kind of data are they an authoritative source of? So they have parcels, building footprints, administrative boundaries, census data, schools, demographics for neighborhoods, points of interest, school ratings, traffic volume for neighborhoods. As far as the property side of things goes, they have ownership information, loan and sales transactions, contacts and mailing addresses, historical aerial photography. So you can use the WhiteBox platform to do your analysis in the platform itself, or there's a set of APIs that you can use to get a hold of the data that way and perhaps build your own analysis around it, or you can bulk download these data sets as files. If you're looking for a real estate information and technology platform, check out WhiteBox. I'll put a link in the show notes to make it a little bit easier for you to find. Thanks, WhiteBox. Really appreciate your support. Hey, John. Welcome back to the podcast. So you've been here before. Last time we were talking about WhiteBox Tools, what it is, what we can use it for, and how you built it. And this time around, I really want to hear about the business of WhiteBox Tools. It started off as an open source project, or it still is an open source project, but perhaps more of a hobby project, and now you're building a business around it. Perhaps for those of us who haven't heard the first episode, perhaps you could just introduce yourself quickly, please, explain what WhiteBox Tools is, and give us a bit of context before we move off and talk about this topic of building a business around an open source project.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to talk to you again. As a way of introduction, I am a professor at the University of Guelph, and in about 2017, I started a project known as WhiteBox Tools. WhiteBox Tools is a geospatial analysis platform that is used worldwide to perform basic spatial analysis operations, much like a GIS in a box, I suppose.
So that was in 2017. I remember from our last conversation, there was a significant build up to WhiteBox Tools. This isn't your first sort of kick at the can. I remember you saying something like that in our last conversation. So I think that's important that people understand this. But even though you started in 2017 with WhiteBox Tools, you've been going for quite some time before we got there, building open source software. Can you tell me a little bit about what it's like to be an open source developer on a project like WhiteBox? Is it stressful? Is it busy? Is it satisfying? And what is it like?
Well, it's all of those things, really. Like you say, I've been developing open source software really since my PhD, so going on 20 years now. And I've been involved in a number of different projects, lead on, I guess, 3 major open source GIS projects at this point, including WhiteBox Tools. And there are definitely a lot of times where working on these projects is immensely rewarding, in particular when you're speaking to people or encounter people in day-to-day life who use the software that you're doing for their own work, for their own research. It can be very rewarding and very exciting to hear about how people are using it. At the same time, it can also be quite stressful at times when the demands of a large user community on your time become at odds with your day-to-day work, which, as I said, in my case, I work as a full-time professor. And typically every morning I wake up, check my email, as most people do, and I'll see emails from various WhiteBox users asking how to do this or how to do that, or asking for help when they encounter particular issues. And for the most part, that can be quite easy for me to handle. But there are times in the year in the job of a professor that can be a little busier than others. And at those points, the task of managing a large open source project can be a little daunting at times. And I guess that's where the business came in.
Okay, so again, just to recap, so you've been doing this for a long time now. WhiteBox Tools was started in 2017. Why have you decided to turn it into a business now? What changed?
Well, I guess it is that pulling of my efforts in different directions with my day-to-day teaching and research associated with being a professor, coming at odds with my leadership of the WhiteBox project. These demands of my time in different ways kind of came to a head when I realized that the community had grown to such a size that I was having a hard time with being able to provide a level of support to the user community that I was satisfied with. And thinking about various solutions for that, ultimately all of them that I could think of involved having people working on the project full time. And given I'm not going to give up my day job as a professor anytime soon, that meant hiring someone and paying someone. And so ultimately that's where the seeds of the idea of creating a business came around. So about a year ago now, a little over a year ago, we launched the company, and the idea for the company came, I guess, about a year and a half ago. At the time, I was speaking with some of the people at my university who work for the Research Innovation Office, the office for converting research into business opportunities effectively. And they were asking me, have you thought about this as a potential solution, the creation of a startup company developed around this software project as a means of generating revenue that you could then use to hire people to support the user community as a whole. And that was really the origin of the company to begin with.
So you said we then, just before. Have you partnered with someone on this?
I have indeed. So WhiteBox Geospatial Inc., the company that we formed, is actually a collaboration between myself and Anthony Francione. Again, when I was speaking to the people in our research innovation office at the University of Guelph, they early on suggested that it would be a good idea in doing this, having experience with many different professors who have started up companies, to have a co-founder. And so at the time, Anthony was working in my research group as a research associate, previously having done a master's with me. And thinking about the various people that I would want to go on this journey with, very early on, I had narrowed it down to Anthony being the most likely candidate that, would be able to complement the strengths that I have and also fill in some of the weaknesses that I have. It's important in a journey like this to be able to find someone who can fill in the gaps for you, for sure.
Would you mind just elaborating on that just a little bit? Like what kind of skill set were you looking for? What kinds of complementary abilities did you see in Anthony? And the reason I'm asking this is because I think there'll be other people out there that are doing similar work, perhaps in a similar place as what you are, and are thinking, I need to create some revenue around this to have the resources to get this project where I want it to be. A business might be a great idea, but doing business alone is really lonely. And looking for a partner could be a fantastic solution, but you need to understand what it is that you're missing, at least I think, if I'm looking for a business party. So I'd be curious to know, what were you missing and what did you see in Anthony?
That's an excellent question. So, you do need to, when you start this sort of venture, be a little introspective and think about what your limitations are in particular. And I know in my case, I would say that, I struggle a little bit with the outward facing side of a large project like this. I am naturally introverted, very, very much so. And Anthony is certainly better at communicating with the public than I would say that I am. Also, on the business side of things, I tend to be best when I'm focused very intensely on small issues. The development side, the coding side. I obviously excel at that. It's where I'm most comfortable. But when you're starting a business, there are all kinds of procedural aspects that come up that require you to sort of take a look at the broader picture. And Anthony truly excels at that. So I think the things that I'm good at and the things that he's good at work together and have allowed us to I don't know if I can yet say successfully, given we're only a year old, but to actually achieve this goal of developing a company that generates revenue.
You use the word successful, and this is a really interesting word. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear what you think success would look like for this business venture. And then I'd like to sort of move off and talk about, well, what have you tried to get there, and what's working now. But what would success look like for you now with WhiteBox Tools?
So, I mean, I've been honest about this right from the get go. I never ever imagined WhiteBox Geospatial as being some, you know, multinational, multi-billion dollar conglomerate by any means. It's not the end goal for this company. The company really is designed from the outset to provide support around the open source WhiteBox Tools platform. We're essentially just trying to generate revenue to support, in this case, Anthony, to be able to work full time on the company in order to help with the community facing side of things. And to me, that's success. If we can year over year produce enough revenue to be able to have one or two employees that can help to deal with the user community, to help create resources, learning resources around the user community, or targeting the user community, and to further the development of the open core, then I'd say that we've achieved our goal. And that to me is the most important thing. I'm not in this to make millions, for the last 20 years or more now, as I've been developing software, I've had numerous colleagues who have sort of scratched their head when they look at the projects that I've been developing and think to themselves and say to me very often, why don't you just quit this gig and just make millions making software? And I've long said that that's not really the goal of what I'm in this business for by any means.
Okay, so success looks like the maintenance and development of these tool sets and the community that have gathered around it. So I think that's a really admirable goal. I have to say that. How are you going to get there? What kinds of things did you start doing? Was it a year and a half ago, I think, when you started the company with Anthony, to get you to that success, to start earning revenue, to get you to the place that you want to be?
It was about a year and a half ago that we came up with the idea of the company, and we actually launched June of 2021. So a little over, I guess, a year and a month now. In terms of the things that we've tried out in order to move towards this goal of what we envision as success, boy, there have been so many things that we have trialed. I think probably one of the most successful things for us obviously has been the creation of extension products for the open core. So over the past year, I've put a fair amount of effort into developing about 65 tools that can extend the open core functionality. And so we've put those up on our webpage for download and purchase, and you can use them to extend the open core. And we've done that with varying levels of success, I should say. One of the things that we struggled with at the beginning was creating quickly enough at the time of launch a compelling enough product that people would be interested in it. So I think we only launched with something like 12 to 15 tools, so considerably less. So there was a strong urgency, obviously, in order to make a more compelling product to flesh out that tool set to the point where it is today. And then the pricing model, I would say, was very, very challenging for us. We struggled with figuring out what an appropriate pricing model. I'd say that is something that we struggled with up until really this year. So probably around January or February, having tinkered with the pricing, up and down in both directions, we finally figured out what the appropriate price would be for each of the extension tool sets. And I'd say we finally have the right formula for that. Other things that we've tried or thought about, so certainly consulting, and I should say that at the moment, it's safe to say that at least for year one, the majority of our income that we've had, of our revenue, has come from consulting services that we've done. So we've had a couple of contracts that have come in and have been quite fundamental in supporting the company. And looking forward to year two, we're hoping that a larger proportion of our revenue will be coming from software. We've also recently experimented with charging for the open core. And I say charging, but it's really a pay-as-you-go or pay as much as you want model. So now when you download the open core from our webpage, there are some buttons that are there that allow you to select between $0 and $100 that you can pay for the WhiteBox Tools open core binary to download, and that has been actually really successful for us. We weren't sure when we first created it whether or not it would be a successful form of revenue for the company, and it's turned out to be quite a steady, consistent revenue source for us. The inspiration for that came the other day when I was downloading Elementary OS, which is a Linux distribution, and saw that they had a very similar model, and thought, well, that's a darn good idea that we could apply, and it's been really useful.
Congratulations. I'm sure there was a lot of sort of heartbreak along the way as you tried out these things, failed, and had to iterate on them. And I think even trying something for the first time can be a little bit scary. At least it is for me. I want to talk about the extensions that you've created. You talked about creating a compelling product, and then, of course, getting the pricing right around that. How did you know what to create? How did you know what people wanted? Did you simply take some existing tools and like the most popular tools perhaps and put them behind a paywall, or did you create brand new tools?
I mean, we struggled with that very question in the early days of the company. I mean, I made a commitment to the user community that the tools that are part of the open core, which at this point are quite substantial, I think about 460 or so tools, 430 tools, something like that, are in the open core. And I made this commitment that they would forever be there and that people could use them. So early on, when we went to launch and realized we have to have a product that we can sell if we're going to generate revenue, obviously the thinking in discussing it with people would be, oh well, you could just take some of these many hundreds of tools and take the ones that will sell and put them behind a paywall. But I was very much against that idea, and that left us with the challenge of having to create new tools. So as I say, we're now sitting at about 65 or so public tools. There's always a few that I have sort of in the works that are in the development branch that I'm testing. So I think it's 65 or 63 that are currently available. And in terms of figuring out which tools to create, we've essentially created three different thematic tool sets, one geared towards LiDAR and remote sensing, one geared towards digital elevation models and the processing of topographic data, and spatial hydrology, and the third targeting agriculture. And so essentially what I've been doing is trying to figure out some tools that I think would have great interest in those particular application areas to focus my development efforts on. And I think we've got to the point now where we're starting to see very regular sales of each of those thematic tool sets, as well as the general tool set that includes all the tools from the three previous tools and some extras. In particular, that product is, I would say, our most compelling product as far as value proposition goes, because it seems to make up the majority of our sales. And so I think we've managed to get to a point now where we've fleshed it out such that we can depend month over month on regular sales.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that. Getting back on to this idea of knowing which tools to build now, I know that you're a professor, you work in the space, you work with LiDAR, you work with hydrology, you have all this experience. I think that someone like you who's been creating so many tools for so long, you perhaps understand what's missing. But did you do any sort of market research? Were you getting feedback saying, I'd really like this tool here and now? And I'm wondering too, now that you have those paying customers for these extensions that you've created, are you asking them what they would like to see more of or what they're missing?
I mean, I'm in constant communication with users, both of the customers who've purchased the extension tools and the open core. So that is definitely a source of inspiration for my development efforts. Thinking about the conversations that I have with users and the ways in which they've described how they use it and how they would like to use it, that often is a source of low-hanging fruit for focusing my development efforts. As well, obviously, my own research and teaching informs the development that I do, looking at sort of the state of the science and some of the recent advances in particular fields can be helpful for figuring out where to focus my development efforts in creating future tools. It's always been that way, even with the open core, I would say. It's difficult working in this space because, of course, there are the Esris of the world, there are the QGISs of the world, And so while WhiteBox Tools, I would say, does contain sort of all of the functionality that you'd expect of a general GIS tool set, its real draw is the uniqueness of a certain subset of tools that you aren't going to find elsewhere. And we've always known that in terms of prioritizing, particularly the extensions, that we would need to create a collection of tools that you're just not going to find elsewhere, but that have a general appeal in terms of their ability to provide solutions for people working in the space.
I think too, being the expert that you are, I guess sometimes you just got to trust yourself, like trust your insight. I think when you ask people what you want, what do you want as a user, it can be a really difficult question. And you might get some feedback that's all over the place and really difficult to understand and decipher and say, well, how does this translate into a product? And so it sounds like what you're doing is you're just trusting yourself, your insight that you have after working the space for so long.
I was going to say an important part of that as well. Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is communicating what you've done effectively. So it's often the case where I develop a tool and I think to myself, "Wow, this tool is really useful. It's going to be revolutionary in a particular space." And then you announce the tool and you see that it's sort of fallen flat in terms of the user experience. Maybe Twitter doesn't pick up on it to the extent that you thought that it would, and you realize that it's not enough to just create this wonderful tool that provides this innovative solution to a problem that people have. It's about being able to communicate it to people in an effective form, demonstrating its use in a YouTube video, in a blog, it's hard to do and perhaps in Twitter because of the constrained form of that platform, but being able to communicate what these tools do to users can be one of the biggest challenges, even more so than creating the tools sometimes.
I think what you're getting at here is obviously communication, but packaging as well. How do you package this? How do you show it to someone? What words do you put around it? What images do you use? What's the argument for using this? What is the result that people are going to get when they use this tool? I got to tell you, I experiment with this all the time with trying to promote this podcast episode, for example. Almost every episode that I post on different social media things, I'll repost it many, 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 many times in different packaging, another image, a different text, and it is absolutely amazing how much of a difference the packaging can make. But you need to be confident enough to know that yes, I'm not annoying people. This is not spam. I'm doing it for the right reasons. I'm trying to help people, to teach people something. But I think the temptation is to build something and to put it out in the world once, to get your courage together, put it out in the world once, and if it falls flat, to go, I failed, I wasn't good enough. Instead of saying, well, I need to try again, and having that sort of commitment to the process. I think that's super important.
I mean, you're right. We've talked about this before, but if I've learned anything over the last year, it's that marketing is an enormous part of any business. I've learned so much about that aspect of running a business that I never really thought about going into this process. And you're also right in that, you have all these different avenues for promoting materials like, say, a new tool or a new extension, Twitter, LinkedIn, blogs, newsletters, etc. And to some extent, you often are thinking, am I just beating a dead drum here? I keep saying the same message to each of these different locations. But the reality of it, I think, is, again, you need to have the confidence in knowing that you're speaking to different, if not overlapping, groups of people to each of these avenues, and that it's important to reach out as inclusively as possible to different communities on the web when promoting these things. And that can be a struggle at times to get the right temperature for, but when you get it right, boy, things can take off, and it can be quite a useful tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to stress, none of this is easy. I really admire what you're doing and what you've done. It's absolutely incredible. Earlier on, you talked about consultancy, so services. And I guess what was happening is people were coming to you and say, can you're experts in this. Can you do this job for me? Process this data, do this analysis, something like that. Why is that going to be a focus going forward as well? Would you like to get more work that way?
I mean, that's a very tough question for me, in truth. So it's hard because I think I always envisioned this as being a software company first and foremost. But the reality is, particularly as you're starting up and as you're trying to get community awareness of the software products and flesh the software products out, that you need to be able to support the company. And because of my experience working in a particular area, in particular working with digital elevation data, topographic data, I've developed a network of people who know that these are areas that they're my one little wheelhouse, I guess, that I excel in terms of data processing for DEMs. And so opportunities arose where people within my network have come forward and said, we have this chance for you to earn a little bit of money for the company while doing some work. And again, I work as a full-time professor, so my opportunities to do that are relatively limited. Anthony has fortunately been able to, over the past year, take the lead on those contracts, which is great because, of course, they're providing his salary for the past year. But I never really envisioned this as a services company so much as a software company from the outset. So if we deviate from that vision, certainly we'll be compromising my early intentions for what this company means, and as you said earlier, what success looks like for the company. Which isn't to say we're not open to consulting services. I just would like to see that we're able to support the company, to support Anthony, and if we eventually hire any other employees, largely based off the back of the software products.
So you make it sound like you've got this network, and people just came to you and said, "Okay, great. Can you perhaps help us out with this?" Was it like that, or did you have to tell people we're open for business? You can hire us for these things here. Did you have to actively reach out to people, or did they just see that you had started a business and thought, "Great, perhaps I could hire them"?
So I think the web page has been quite central for this. We put a lot of work early on in the foundation of the company in creating our web page, and a lot of effort since then in revising the web page and getting our message right out there. Putting it out correctly, I guess, and whatever that might well mean. And part of that marketing in terms of the web page has been saying, we do offer services now, and that these are our areas of expertise. And yeah, I mean, the opportunities that have arisen have largely come because often people in my sort of extended network have visited the web page and seen, oh, John and his company is now available to do the kinds of things that we thought that John as a professor would probably turn down, because the research opportunities maybe are a little less, and the work is a little bit more routine and not typically the focus, therefore, of a professor. And so as a result of the company side of things, those opportunities have become more attractive for people who might well have wanted those services in the past. And so, yeah, the opportunities have sort of landed as a result of that. I wouldn't say that up until now, at least, that we have put a great deal of effort in seeking those contracts as perhaps other geospatial firms that are focused on services may well have had in their early days, I would say.
And thank you very much for clarifying that for us. I think that's really important to understand that a lot of this came about because you had put so much effort into the website. I mean, of course, you had the network before, but like putting a sign out in the world and saying, I am open to this kind of work, to these kinds of opportunities, I think it is really important as well. I think sometimes we think people are visionary enough just to imagine what it is that we could do for them instead of being specific about it and saying, we can do this, we can do that, and three of those things over there. I really want to talk about this pay as much as you can. I think you described it in that way when someone downloads the open core. Can you talk us through that again, please?
Sure. So again, we've adopted a sort of pay as much as you will model, or pay as much as you can model. And for the open core, the open core is open source. You can download it for free. You can look at the source code. Of course, it's all available on GitHub. But when you download it from our webpage, in the process of downloading, you'll see that there is a series of buttons. A little message at the top that says something along the lines of pay what you will. The first button is $0, and of course the majority of people will click that. And then there's like $2, $5, $10, $25, $50, $100 increments that people can select. If they do so, then it'll bring them to essentially a Stripe page that will take the collection very seamlessly and then return them to the location where they can download the version of the open core that they want. And this we found to be quite successful. Of course, we struggled at first with the idea of charging for an open core product. And I think, if we had adopted a more heavy-handed approach to this, where everyone who downloaded it needed to pay whatever, $5, I think it probably would be seen more negatively by the user community. But by and large, the feedback that we've had from the user community is, in fact, that they see this as being a valuable way of supporting in a way that they would maybe have been less hesitant to in the past. So, obviously the extensions are a little bit more pricey. They're of the order of hundreds to thousands of dollars, depending on if you're getting an annual subscription or a perpetual license. And there are many people who would like to support the user community, but that may not have the financial wherewithal to be able to do so by buying an extension. And so they've been, that sector of users have been quite vocal about the fact that this provides a wonderful opportunity for them to chip in. And, honestly, $2 makes a big difference to us. If a user downloads it and sends us $2, that makes a tremendous difference to us. $10, it's really fantastic, and to see these regular income, this regular income coming into the company, it's just made it so much more viable for us.
I actually wish more people would do this kind of pay what you can model, and implement it in the way that you have, because I think you've done this absolutely brilliantly.
Well, again, I won't claim to have invented this idea. I did not create this myself. This was stolen quite literally from the Elementary OS, which is also a fantastic open source project, by the way, that people should support. But I think maybe open source projects as a whole are looking towards ways of being able to do this, and I think that is a successful model to strive for.
Would you mind sharing some numbers around this, if you can? Could you give us an idea of how many people are visiting the website, and perhaps the percentage of people that are contributing in this way?
Sure. So in terms of visitors to the website, I can say that at this point, since the launch of the webpage, which I think happened towards the end of May in 2021, we've had about 150,000 visitors to the site. It's up and down day to day in terms of whether we say have a tweet about a new tool or a newsletter or something like that. But typically, between 200 and I'd say about on really good days, about 1,600 visitors per day. In terms of downloads from the web page, that varies as well. On a weekend, we might get about 30 or so downloads. On a weekday, we get about, I'd say on a good day, maybe 60 or so downloads of the open core specifically. In terms of people who choose to donate, it's hard to say. It varies. We get about $300 a month through those. And I should say again that we only started doing this about a month and a half ago. So this is still early days. We get, in terms of conversion rate, again, it's a little tricky, especially because it's a fairly new thing, but we get about one purchase of the open core for about every about 40 to 60 downloads. So we get about one a day, sometimes two, sometimes three times a day.
That is fantastic. Congratulations. Has anybody pushed back on this? Like, you talked about a lot of the user community being positive and seeing this as a sort of a step forward for the toolbox itself, building more stability around it, knowing that it's going to be there in the future and well supported and well resourced. But has anyone said, hey, I'm not into this. This is free. This is open source. Why are you ruining it by making it a business?
Yeah, that's interesting. So when we first launched that particular feature about a month and a half ago, I won't lie, we were really nervous. We were waiting with bated breath to see when that first download would happen after we made the feature live, to see if people start, if we saw that there were fewer downloads than there typically would be. So the user community saw that aspect, of the new aspect of the web page, and rejected it, and stopped downloading it from our page, or if we would start to get a flood of emails from people who were irate. And that did not happen at all. So the number of downloads didn't change at all. And we haven't been approached by anyone who has said that they were upset about the fact that this is there. I think in part it's because of the context around that feature. So it's not like we just put this up there. There's a little preamble of text before you see the buttons that download that essentially describes why it's there, what the rationale. Again, as you said, the idea is to be able to create a thriving project that has continued development and to be able to provide this for the growing user community. But also, we provide a little bit of context in terms of the reality of large scale open source projects and some of the burdens that are on the user, or rather on the developers of those projects. So I make a link to, I believe it's a Wired article that describes open source burnout effectively and some of the challenges that are associated with that. In terms of the broader question of building a business around an open source project, how can you create a for revenue business around a project that is based on open source? Similarly, a year and a half ago when I was first thinking about this, I was grappling with that idea. The reality, however, to me was that I couldn't keep going on the way that I was, just as a sole developer of a project that was getting so much traction. It was just too much of a burden at that point. And so I knew that revenue had to come in some way. And so developing the business just seemed like the answer that everyone around me was saying is the logical way of being able to generate that revenue. And by and far, I'd say, even though I sort of dipped my toes in the cold water nervously at the start, I now on this end of it realize that I made the right decision. In particular, I come to realize that when it comes to open source projects, and WhiteBox is no exception, there are out there every day many thousands of people who use the software that we create as open source developers in their day-to-day lives, for research, for education, for earning money in terms of a company, revenue in a company. And so if there are companies out there that can use WhiteBox tools in order to generate their revenue, then it somewhat only makes sense, I suppose, that the developer of that tool should also be able to use it, leverage it to be able to generate revenue. And again, given, at least personally, my view of what this company meant wasn't to enrich myself personally. And I should say, we're only a year into this now, but I've not drawn any revenue from this company at this point. It essentially is just there to be able to support people to be able to focus on the project full time, which is something that as a full-time professor, I simply don't have time to do. My wife, I'm sure, would tell you that I probably dedicate far more time to the project than she would like. And it's obviously often evenings and weekends of personal time, but it's a labor of love. It's a passion of mine, and I'm happy to do that. So that's my thought on that, I suppose.
No, again, I really appreciate that. I really do. Is your website, is that the only place I can download WhiteBox Tools? Is that the only place I can download it and buy these extensions or pay what I can?
No, it's not. So, in fact, it's not even the main way I would say that people access it. So there is, in fact, a pip install. So there's a community member who develops a fair number of the front ends, Wu, who has put a fair amount of effort in packaging WhiteBox tools in ways that make it more accessible for the user community. Probably the largest of those is the pip install for Python users. And in fact, we just passed a milestone last week where it's been downloaded 250,000 times from the pip repository on PyPy. And then there's the Conda download, and as well the CRAN download for the R front end. So there are a number of places in which people can download the open core. In terms of the extensions, in fact, we've designed the open core so that there's just a simple command and it will automatically install the extensions for you. Of course, you still need to purchase a license for them, and that, yes, the web page is the place to go for purchasing an extension license rather.
This is going to make me sound really greedy and money focused, but is there any part of you that wishes that there was also an opportunity through those pip installs, through those other front ends to donate, to give back to the project, or to maybe sort of create some sort of bottleneck where you could only get at our website, and therefore we could reach this goal of what you described as success looking like for you earlier, quicker?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's true. So obviously downloads from our webpage are a drop in the bucket compared to pip. Pip can have easily, on a slow day, 200 downloads to upwards of 1,000 or more downloads per day of the open core. So, if you do the conversion of, as I said, 40 to 60 downloads, we get a sale every 46 to 60 downloads. Then obviously if the people who were downloading from pip had an opportunity to see the potential to support the project through the purchase of that download, then we'd be looking at a very different financial outcome for this company. I think we'd probably be getting close to a point where we could support the company just off of those sales from the open core. But at the same time, I want as many people to be able to use this as possible. And given pip is obviously one of the more convenient ways in which the user community is obviously finding their ways to the project, then I'm happy to have them have that opportunity to do so. Anthony and I have talked about ways in which we can capture some of those people who, and in truth, this is, I think, probably the case, that there are definitely users out there in the community who are kind of unaware of WhiteBox Geospatial Inc. They're unaware potentially even of me as the developer of it, because they've simply just downloaded it as a Python package on pip or using pip. And we've thought about ways in which we can perhaps capture some of that audience and draw them to the web page so that they can see that this library that they're using is part of a larger project and part of a larger company. And that's admittedly been a bit of a struggle in trying to figure out how we can get people to the page. Things like this podcast certainly help. Things like our newsletter certainly help. And of course, tweeting and LinkedIn posts, those types of things make the community as a whole perhaps more aware of the entity that's behind this pip install that they use, that they do, and that they use in their own research and work. But that is something that we definitely think about for sure.
So I remember from a previous conversation, you described WhiteBox Tools as the backend to many front ends. And I wonder if this is the downside, that what you're seeing in terms of marketing, that it's the back end. It's not very, very visible. I know you've put a lot of work into the documentation onto your website. I know that Anthony is creating YouTube videos. I know that you're active on social media. But have you got any other ideas of how you're going to change this visibility problem that you have being a back end product?
I mean, you're right. We do have this problem. So I think our company launched with a number of advantages and one particular disadvantage. The advantages were that we had an established user community. What was a known entity, having developed previous projects, and so we had an audience for our work, and that was good. But the main disadvantage is that I've been developing in the back end, and I said to you earlier that I'm an introvert, and I've often said that WhiteBox is like its developer. It's also an introvert. It prefers to be in the background, and that's very much like myself. But as far as a company goes, this has been our single largest disadvantage. So there are probably about 10 different front ends. For example, LeafMap, which is gaining quite a bit of traction, uses WhiteBox Tools in its backend, or at least as part of its backend, I believe. And there are a number of others, like the Open LiDAR toolbox. And oftentimes these front ends get much more of the attention, much more light shined on them. And people don't necessarily realize that it's WhiteBox Tools in the background that's making those things work, or at least, in terms of the analytical side of things. And so we have definitely got a visibility problem. We've talked before about how to address that. I think maybe creating our own front end would somewhat alleviate that, although time and resources would have to be spent in doing that. And of course, people want to use it the way that they want to use it. And in many ways, it was the motivation for creating WhiteBox Tools in the first place. We talked about this in the previous episode, but the reason I created WhiteBox Tools was because having developed previously WhiteBox Geospatial Analysis Tools, WhiteBox GAT, many of the comments that I was getting were that people wanted to be able to use the tool set outside of the GUI, outside of the GIS that I had written. And so I created WhiteBox Tools with the idea that it could be easily plugged into different front ends. And it's been successful in that regard. And its success has been the great challenge of our company, because we are a back-end product ultimately. And that's a little bit tricky to navigate. And I don't say that we have all the answers for how to deal with that particular problem. I imagine that many of the people who might be in similar positions in terms of working on open source software maybe don't necessarily find themselves in that situation, which I will find enviable for sure. But yes, you put your finger on the number one challenge that our company has, I would say.
I wonder if you could gain some of this visibility that you're lacking through strategic partnerships. I wonder if there's other projects that you could partner with that are a very popular front end or have another audience, or I wonder if there's any sort of natural sort of partnerships that you could create and help each other along the way, a front end and a back end, helping each other out to be successful businesses.
I like the sounds of that for sure. We haven't had very many opportunities along those lines up until now. We haven't been approached by people. Typically, the front ends, as I said, are open source projects where they're not designed around a business necessarily. And being an open source backend, they just plug it in, and oftentimes there's relatively little communication between myself as the backend developer and the front end developers. Sometimes literally no communication. We just find out that WhiteBox has been embedded in a front end, and that's great. I love to see that. That's what I like to see. But it would be interesting if there is a front end company looking for enhancing their analytical power in the back end. If partnerships could be forged to help both companies, that would be an exciting opportunity for us for sure. But as of yet, no such opportunities have presented themselves.
Do you have an idea of who is using it? So we talked about this user community, and I guess what I'm thinking here is that if you know that businesses are using them, using the tools that you've created, could you imagine a time where you reach out to them and say, hey, look, we know that you've downloaded this. Would you consider donating to this so we can continue the work? Or not donating, would you consider supporting us so we can continue, supporting this project, which, you are dependent on?
That's also... Daniel, you ask excellent questions, and this is why you're such a good podcaster. So that's something that we've talked about in the company a little bit, I suppose, is perhaps reaching out to long-term users of the open core and asking them if they could in some way support the company. And that could be as small as, allowing us to even say on our webpage that, this organization is using WhiteBox Tools in their business logic. That would be, or in their day-to-day operations, that would be very helpful to us, even if financial support isn't there. And it's not something that we've done to date, I should say. So we have been fairly hands-off in terms of directing the user community towards the revenue generating aspects of the project, and focusing more on creating compelling products that we can then sell to help people enhance their WhiteBox based workflows. But it's entirely possible, and I think having seen the success of the pay what you can open core model that we launched a month and a half ago, that perhaps a more active approach to engaging with particularly our larger enterprise based users might be something that we should do more actively, I think.
I wonder, alongside this pay what you can model, if there was a model that said, or an option that said something like, okay, so if you can't pay, here are other ways that you can help us out. You can link to us from your website. You can share that you're using these tools on your social media channels. You could mention us in a blog post, that kind of thing. Like these are other ways of letting people contribute without paying money. It would mean the world to you guys in terms of your marketing and your search engine optimization, in terms of the traffic that you'll get to the website, and ultimately a visibility, which would lead to a higher conversion rate, or not more conversions, I should say. And it would be a way of people like being part of the project, contributing to something, giving back, I guess, in a way without spending money.
You're right. A lot of these, non-direct sources of support can be game changers for us. Having a link in the right place on the right webpage back to whiteboxgeospatial.com is for us golden sometimes. Every now and then we'll have a day where we look at the traffic and think, what the heck has happened here? We have this huge spike in traffic, and we realize, oh, someone has blogged about their use of WhiteBox Tools, or someone has appealed to their user community that they should support WhiteBox Tools, and it's resulted in a huge spike for us, and therefore more awareness, which down the road, of course, can lead to sales of extensions or the open core. So Yeah, I mean, we should probably be more proactive. Again, it's kind of a cop out to say we've only been around for a year, but we've been experimenting over that past year with things that have worked for us and things that have not. And looking forward to year two, we definitely need to think about some of the ways in which we can perhaps more actively cultivate these types of non-financial support in order to increase the user awareness that we even exist. Again, I think we have a visibility problem because we are in the back end. And of course, eventually bringing more traffic to the page means more potential revenue.
John, I'm sure we could go back and forth on some of these ins and outs of marketing a business all day long because, personally, I find it fascinating. I've got a few quick questions to ask you before we wrap this up. So you've been building open source software for a long time now, and you've just started building a business. So far, which do you think is more challenging, writing code or building a business?
Hands down, building a business. Developing code is a joy for me. I would do it 24/7 if I could, in truth. I love coding. I love having a problem that is difficult to solve and spending a day or two just trying to work out the various approaches to solving that problem. The business, a lot of the challenges that you face in developing a business are a little bit more intractable, or at least maybe things that my mind isn't necessarily designed to deal with. A lot of the marketing aspect of things that we've talked about, web page development, interfacing with various aspects of running a business, taxes, things like that, are things that are challenging and perhaps not necessarily things that you get into a business for. Or at least they're not the main activities that you really think of yourself doing, but you will find yourself doing a lot of. And not having a business background, a lot of that has been a struggle for me as I sort of learn and get my feet under myself in terms of sorting out how to deal with these particular issues. And again, that's where having a co-founder like Anthony has been tremendously useful. So anyone in a similar position where maybe they're working on or have developed an open source project and they're thinking about commercializing that and bringing it to market, I would definitely say don't underestimate the difference in your efforts with respect to the development efforts that you've probably laid the groundwork for compared to the business side of things, and that perhaps getting someone on your side who has maybe a better mindset for that and can fill in some of the gaps that you may well have is well worth your while.
Yeah, finding that person that has a complementary skill set, I think, is super important. My last question here, I'm sure that I know where you're going to land on this one, but I'd like to ask it anyway. Who is responsible for supporting these kinds of projects? For making sure that they continue, for making sure that they are resourced, that they are maintained. Do you think it's up to the developer to lift that as well, or do you think it's up to the community?
Well, so I think the developer in creating a project has a certain responsibility. When I create software and put it out there for the world to use, that creation comes with it a certain responsibility for sure. And I'm very aware of that and conscious of it and think of it very frequently. But at the same time, a project lives and dies by its user community. So the fact that WhiteBox Tools has been created again on sort of the back of my evenings and weekends and a lot of volunteer time, if you're out there using it, perhaps in your education, so in teaching, or for enterprise, if you're using it, say in a commercial setting or even perhaps in government, then there's a certain responsibility to ensure that the project thrives. And that's not just for WhiteBox, obviously, but for all open source infrastructure that we depend upon for society to function. And there have been many cases where open source developer burnout has resulted in critical infrastructure for the functioning of the internet, for example, essentially not being there in the future. And that's, I think, sad to see. And it's the result of obviously a user community that has taken for granted the efforts of a small number of individuals in the open source community that have been largely contributing in their own personal time. And of course, it can't always go like that. And so fortunately, there are many thriving open source communities where the user community has invested heavily in the ongoing development of that key infrastructure that they depend upon. And it would be nice to see that more widely throughout the open source world, I would say.
John, I really want to thank you for for taking the time to talk with me first and foremost. I really appreciate it. I'm grateful for your insights. I really hope that other people in perhaps a similar position to you listen to this and can either draw comfort from it, knowing that they are not the only ones that are walking around with these problems or with these feelings, and also seeing that it's possible, that I can turn my project into a business if I desire. It might just require a lot of work and perhaps some different skill sets. I really, really appreciate that. And thank you for creating these tools and sort of distributing them freely around the internet for people to use and enjoy and solve problems with. It's absolutely amazing. We've said the name quite a few times, but just so everyone understands where they can go to check out your work, see what you're building, what is the web address we can send people to?
www.whiteboxgeo.com. That's our home on the web. And if I may, Daniel, thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure to speak to you. And if today's talk helps even just one other person who might find themselves in a similar position or might be grappling with these same issues, then I'd say it was well worthwhile.
Thanks again, John. I hope we can talk again soon.
Me as well. Take care.
Thanks again to Lightbox for sponsoring this podcast episode. If you are in the US or Canada and want to locate your customers and prospects using addresses, geocoding, and property information, or if you're working in real estate, government, telecommunications, insurance, energy, or utilities, check out Lightbox. That's lightboxre.com, and there'll be a link in the show notes of this episode to make it easier for you to find. Thanks, Lightbox. Really appreciate your support. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode with John Lindsay. Again, if you haven't heard the first episode, which was published the week before this one, so the previous episode, go back and listen to that. It'll add a little bit more context, and WhiteBox Tools as a software product is pretty amazing. It's worth knowing about. So John is a software developer. He's been doing this. He's been working on these kinds of open source geospatial projects for 20 years now. And my guess is that John is really comfortable with the idea of debugging code and iterating on a piece of software to make it better. And you might feel like that in your work as well. The first time you do run an analysis or you're working on a process, it's not great, right? It's not as good as it could be. Not the first time around, but it gets better. It's an iterative process. John was talking about pricing. He said he really, really struggled to find a pricing model that he felt comfortable with and that worked, that converted, that people were happy to pay. And this was an iterative process, making a mistake, learning from it, trying again. I think we're all pretty comfortable with that iterative process when we're talking about some sort of technical environment. But when it comes to standing in front of somebody and saying, here, I made this, for some reason that this is totally different. It's significantly harder. At least I found it significantly harder. And I remember at the start, I was so terrified of making a mistake. I was sure that if I got things wrong, well, that was it. I wouldn't get to play the game anymore. I would be out, which is not the case. With time, I've come to realize that this is just another iterative process. John mentioned a similar thing in terms of marketing. He talked about the need to get your communication right, to find ways of describing what it is that you're doing. And for me, I term this as packaging. The packaging isn't working. Change it. Try some new packaging. Try again. Iterate. And of course, all of this is significantly harder if the work that we're doing, the thing that we're making, is not visible. If people can't find it, if they don't know it exists, or don't know we exist. One of the people I really look up to in the marketing world, Seth Godin, often says that the ideas that spread are the ideas that win. And I think a lot about how I can make ideas spread. So I'm not talking about being clickbaity and making promises that you can't keep, but I do think a lot about visibility. How can I make this visible? How can I make this shareable? I don't think we can expect people to care about things they don't know about. So I guess the question becomes, how can we become known? How can our work become known? Unfortunately, I don't think there's any easy answer to any of these questions. And if there is, I definitely haven't found it because, clearly this is still a work in progress for me. Thanks very much for tuning in this week. Thanks very much for listening to this episode. I hope that you'll take the time to join me again next week. In the meantime, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on social media at Mapscaping on Twitter, or check out the show notes of this episode for other ways to contact me. Okay, that's it from me. We'll talk again soon. Bye.